Hey guys. Tonight we wander into a world the history books tend to whisper about. Forget the shining armor, the glorious battles, and the sacred hymns echoing through stone cathedrals. Tonight, we slip behind the closed doors of medieval castles, where the air smells faintly of wax, wine, and secrets that would make even a confessor blush. You'll find yourself standing in a corridor lit by trembling candlelight, hearing the rustle of velvet and the murmur of promises not meant for daylight. You might think you could survive this place. But honestly, you wouldn't last a night. Between the cold drafts sneaking under the tapestries and the politics of passion twisting through every corner. The Middle Ages were less about romance and more about survival of desire. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it there? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander down a long, echoing hallway of stone. The walls are draped with faded tapestries depicting knights slaying dragons. But none of them warn about the real beasts lurking inside these walls: human longing, greed, and lust disguised as devotion. Somewhere nearby, a court minstrel plucks at a lute, and the melody seeps through the cracks like spilled honey. You pause before a carved wooden door. Behind it, laughter, not the joyful kind, but something hushed and knowing. In a castle like this, laughter meant danger. Every whisper could be a rumor, every glance a test of loyalty. The noble class didn't just trade lands and titles, they traded affection like coins. A misplaced kiss could spark a duel. A secret affair could decide a war. Take, for instance, Eleanor of Aquitaine, brilliant, defiant, and rumored to have turned the art of courtly love into political strategy. Historians still debate whether her court was a breeding ground for chivalry or simply the most sophisticated dating club in Europe. Either way, she set the tone for an age where pleasure and power were as entangled as vines on a crumbling tower. You imagine walking through her great hall, the scent of roasted meat mingling with perfume, gold goblets clink, candles flicker, and noble women fan themselves behind masks of courtesy. The air feels heavy with expectation, like the moment before lightning strikes. And you, standing there in your modern hoodie and jeans, feel wildly out of place. One joke of the time went that a true knight served both his lord and his lady, though not always in that order. It sounds gallant, but most of these romances were survival tactics. A single misstep, and you could find yourself exiled, imprisoned, or forced into a monastery faster than you could say, Ave Maria. Still, the thrill was irresistible. The castle at night was alive, corridors humming with secret footsteps, chambers echoing faint sighs, a tapestry shifting ever so slightly as someone slipped behind it. Desire here was like a game of chess, strategic, dangerous, and rarely about love. Some historians suggest that the Middle Ages were a time of repression. Others argue they were anything but that. Behind the sermons and the scourges lay an obsession with pleasure so deep it terrified the church. The truth probably lies somewhere between confession and fantasy. After all, it was an age obsessed with sin. And nothing tempts like what's forbidden. Imagine, for a moment, the Queen's chamber. layers of silk, furs draped like trophies, and a bed so enormous it could fit a small militia. Yet privacy was nearly impossible. Servants dozed in corners, courtiers lingered outside the door, and gossip traveled faster than plague. To love someone in this world was to risk everything: your name, your safety, your soul. And yet, they did. Again and again. Maybe that's the part that feels timeless. Because even in an age of superstition and chains, humans still sought warmth in another's touch. They still looked across a crowded hall and felt that flicker, the same one that makes hearts race even today. You can almost hear the murmur of voices now. The soft clinking of a decanter being poured. A nobleman jokes about his secret pilgrimages to the chambermaid's quarters. The others laugh politely, pretending not to notice their own indiscretions. Someone plays with a lock of hair not their own. Someone else whispers, "For the sake of God, be quiet." The church, of course, preached restraint. Priests thundered from pulpits about the dangers of flesh, about how even a glance could damn your soul. Yet the same preachers were often found entangled in their own scandals. One chronicler, trying to be polite, once wrote that monks had a remarkable interest in female piety. Historians still debate exactly what he meant by that. You step out onto a balcony overlooking the courtyard. The moon is high, casting the stones in silver. Below, two shadows meet briefly near the stables, one cloaked, one bareheaded. They linger a second too long. You're not supposed to see this. But that's the thing about history. It's built on moments people tried to hide. And somewhere inside the keep, a scribe is scratching words onto parchment, documenting births, alliances, wars, but never these moments. They were the unwritten side of history. The private world that never made it into the chronicles. Maybe that's why they fascinate us so much now. Because for all the armor, faith, and bloodshed, the Middle Ages were also profoundly human. Desire didn't disappear under the weight of stone cathedrals, it just hid in the shadows. Waiting. As you lean against the cold wall, you can almost hear it. The heartbeat of a time when love was both sacred and dangerous. When every kiss could be a prayer or a sin. Tomorrow, we'll wander deeper, into the steaming bathhouses where purity met temptation. Where men and women shed not just their clothes but their reputations. But for now, stay here a little longer. Let the torches flicker, let the laughter fade into whispers. The night in the castle is long, and the secrets are only beginning to breathe. The next night unfolds in steam. You step into a medieval bathhouse, and instantly, your senses surrender. The air is warm, heavy, and smells faintly of rosemary, sweat, and melted candle wax. Somewhere, water trickles from a copper spout into a wooden tub, and the soft murmur of conversation ripples through the haze. Bathhouses were the social media of the Middle Ages. News spread here faster than any town crier could shout. Deals were made, marriages arranged, and reputations destroyed, all between splashes of lukewarm water. You might think of a spa, but forget the cucumber masks and soft jazz. This was part church, part tavern, part temptation. You move closer, the fog wrapping around you like fabric. Men and women aren't always separated here, depending on the century. The city, or how much you could bribe the guard. In Paris or Prague, bathhouses were sometimes mixed, and no one batted an eye. It was said that a man's cleanliness reflected his soul, though sometimes the soul wasn't the part people were most interested in cleansing. The water ripples as someone steps in. A woman laughs, low and musical. A man replies with something in Latin. Probably not scripture. You catch words like amor and virtus, love and virtue, which, in a bathhouse, sound like inside jokes. And yet, this wasn't just debauchery. Bathhouses were one of the few places where ordinary people, peasants, merchants, even monks, could share space, scrub shoulders, and talk without titles. For a few hours, you could forget who you were. Imagine that. A medieval peasant soaking beside a minor noble, both pretending the world outside didn't exist. Of course, not everyone approved. The church viewed these steamy gatherings with deep suspicion. Priests warned that warm water weakens the spirit, which might just be medieval code for, "We know what you're doing in there." But the bathhouses persisted anyway. They were simply too comforting to give up, especially in an age where winters bit like wolves. And hygiene was often an act of faith. You picture yourself lowering into the tub, the water cloudy, the heat wrapping around you until your mind drifts. The gossip nearby is delicious. Someone claims the baker's wife has been visiting the baths twice a day. Someone else swears a knight confessed his sins between scrubbing sessions. One man chuckles, "The water may cleanse the body, but not the mind." That's your first little joke of the night, but in the Middle Ages, it was barely a joke at all. The line between purity and pleasure blurred like steam on glass. In some towns, bathhouses even hired musicians to play soft tunes, lutes, flutes, or small drums, to disguise the laughter and murmurs that echoed a bit too sweetly. Candlelight shimmered across damp stone walls. Attendants carried trays of herbs, honey, and sometimes wine. A long soak could end with a massage, a meal, or something less spiritual. Records from the 13th century tell of certain bathhouses doubling as houses of recreation. The term sounds innocent enough, doesn't it? But these were places where cleanliness and carnality became one business model. Still, the line wasn't always clear. Some visitors came only to bathe, others to socialize, and some, well, let's just say they sought spiritual rebirth by full immersion. Historians still argue whether these establishments were dens of sin or centers of healing. The truth, as usual, floats somewhere in the middle. You imagine the scholars squinting over manuscripts, debating whether a bathhouse in Vienna was a community hygiene initiative or an erotic enterprise. Same building, different lighting. You notice a painted sign hanging crookedly on the wall, Aqua Pura. Vita Sancta, pure water. Holy life. The irony is delicious. Beneath the slogan, a woman pours water from a jug. Her smile knowing, her gaze direct. She could be an attendant or a temptress, maybe both. In one corner, a monk sits, trying not to look at anyone. He mumbles prayers between dips of his sponge, as if every scrub might erase his thoughts. His presence here isn't rare. Bathhouses were often the only places travelers, including clergy, could wash away weeks of grime. Still, the sight of a monk sharing bathwater with merchants and mistresses must have made quite the sermon topic. A sudden burst of laughter breaks the moment. Someone splashes too hard, someone else protests playfully. You can almost see it, the gleam of torchlight on wet skin. The ripple of ripples. For a second, you forget this is the same era known for plagues, superstition, and endless prayers for forgiveness. Yet, maybe that's what makes it so human. Even in times of suffering, people sought warmth. They wanted to feel alive, clean, desirable. The bathhouse was a refuge from the cold and from the weight of their own sins. Somewhere above, water drips rhythmically, plink, 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 like a clock marking the centuries between then and now. And you realize, with a small smile, that not much has changed. Humanity still gathers in warm places to talk, relax, flirt, and forget the world for a while. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the whispers. Confess nothing, one voice says. Or confess everything, another replies. The steam thickens. Your reflection disappears from the water's surface. For a moment, it feels like time itself is dissolving. Like you're floating between centuries, a ghost watching ghosts. And then, as the laughter fades and the torches dim, you catch a faint scent of lavender. The last bathers are leaving, wrapping themselves in coarse linen. The attendant douses the candles one by one, each extinguished flame leaving a soft thread of smoke. You step out into the cold night air, and it hits you like truth, sharp, clear, a reminder that not every pleasure was a sin, and not every sin deserved punishment. Tomorrow, we'll follow the trail of temptation into the stone corridors of the monasteries, where silence and prayer often met longing and guilt in the most unexpected ways. But for now, breathe out, let the steam fade, the night still hums quietly around you. The night turns colder as you drift through a corridor of carved stone arches. The torches burn lower here, their flames small and steady, like hearts trying to hide their warmth. The smell of incense lingers in the air, sweet, heavy, and faintly guilty. You're standing at the gates of a medieval monastery, where walls were meant to keep sin out, but often ended up trapping it inside. The silence feels absolute, no laughter, no market chatter, no rustle of silk gowns like in the castle halls, only the whisper of your own footsteps. You might think this is a place of peace, but under the chanting and the rituals, something more human was always stirring. After all, locking away desire doesn't kill it, it just teaches it how to pray. You pass through the cloister, where monks walk in slow circles, heads bowed, their habits brush against the stone, making a soft, rhythmic sound. You imagine them murmuring psalms while their thoughts drift elsewhere, to forbidden faces, to touches they'll never admit. Historians like to debate this part of medieval life. Were these vows of chastity upheld, or merely rehearsed? The records are discreet, but the margins of old manuscripts tell another story, tiny sketches of lovers, hidden among the holy words. You smile a little at the thought. Somewhere, a scribe must have giggled while drawing a pair of scandalous figures next to a prayer for purity. The church didn't like to talk about such things, but the evidence inked itself anyway. The rule of silence was sacred. Monks were forbidden to speak except during certain hours. But the human body doesn't need words to communicate. A lingering look across the refectory, a brush of fingers while passing the bread, the flicker of a candlelight reflecting in someone's eyes a second too long. Each moment small enough to deny, but heavy enough to remember. And then there were the confessions. Ah, the confessions. You step into a narrow chapel lit only by a single oil lamp. The air smells of wax and something more fragile, secrets. Behind the wooden lattice, a voice trembles, confessing impure thoughts. The priest, unseen, listens. You can almost hear the strain in his breathing as he reminds the sinner to resist temptation. But what happens when the confessor is tempted too? In one recorded case from France, a young nun confessed her dreams to her spiritual advisor. His guidance became personal. They both ended up in disgrace. Their letters preserved as proof. Historians still argue whether it was love or manipulation, devotion or desire. The church called it a scandal. The human heart would probably call it inevitable. You can't help but imagine the claustrophobia of this world. Stone walls, dim corridors, a life defined by prayer bells. The heart, however, doesn't toll on command. The more they tried to bury desire under doctrine, the more it grew in the dark like ivy. One monk in Italy famously wrote that he felt visited by the devil in dreams. His biographers later discovered the devil had the name of a nearby washerwoman. Another described nightly battles with temptation so vivid he took to sleeping on cold stone floors. That's one way to kill romance, though. As some chroniclers hint, even that didn't always work. You pause before a fresco on the wall, a painting of Saint Mary Magdalene. Her eyes lifted toward heaven, her hair cascading down like golden flame. The artist clearly knew what he was doing. The line between sacred and sensual was paper thin in medieval art. Beauty was considered divine, yet beauty was also the bait of sin. That paradox shaped an entire era. Sometimes, even the architecture betrayed the same tension. The pointed arches, the high vaults reaching toward the sky, symbols of spiritual ascent, but the carvings at their bases often told cheekier stories. Tiny gargoyles with leering faces. Figures in suggestive poses hidden under choir stalls. A kind of cosmic inside joke. Maybe, God above, and mischief below. You can almost hear it. The chorus of monks chanting in perfect harmony. Their voices echoing through the nave. It sounds pure, otherworldly. Yet the same mouths that praised heaven also whispered doubts in the dark. Why, one might have wondered, would God give us such desires only to forbid them? That question, too dangerous to ask aloud, became the pulse beneath centuries of guilt. Here's your second little joke tonight. If repression built cathedrals, desire probably paid for the stained glass. You walk further, your hand brushing the cold wall. It feels damp, like the stone itself remembers all those restless nights. A draft seeps through the cracks, carrying faint echoes, laughter from the nearby village, the clink of a distant tavern. The monks could shut their gates, but the world always found a way to whisper in. Not that nuns were immune either. In convents, letters between women sometimes spoke of spiritual friendship that sounded suspiciously physical. One historian called it mystical affection. Another, less polite, called it a very medieval crush. Scholars still can't decide which description fits better. You picture the cloister garden under moonlight, rows of herbs glistening with dew. The quiet hum of insects. A nun pacing with her rosary. Lost in thought. Maybe she's praying for forgiveness. Or maybe she's praying for a feeling she can't name. Somewhere, the bell rings for Compline, the final prayer of the night. The voices rise again, solemn and steady, until the last amen fades into the dark. For a brief moment, you feel the peace they must have longed for. But it's a fragile peace, easily broken by a thought, a dream, a heartbeat too loud. As you leave the chapel, you glance back one last time. The oil lamp flickers, casting shadows that look almost human. The scent of incense clings to your clothes. You realize that holiness and hunger aren't opposites, they're twins. Born of the same longing to feel alive, to be seen, to be loved. Tomorrow, we'll step back into the world outside these walls, to the courts of nobles and the games of love they played, where poetry disguised passion and flirtation became a form of war. But for now, breathe, let the silence settle. The candles are burning low, and even the monks are beginning to dream. The night drifts on, and the monastery fades behind you like a dream half remembered. Now, the world opens again, this time to a court glittering with gold, perfume, and dangerous smiles. You can almost hear the soft flutter of silk sleeves, the rustle of letters hidden inside them, the metallic clink of armor polished more for beauty than battle. Welcome to the age of courtly love, where passion wore a crown and every glance was a duel. The first thing you notice is how choreographed it all feels. Desire here isn't a wildfire, it's a dance. Precise and poetic. A lady drops her handkerchief. A knight retrieves it with reverence. A look lingers half a second too long across the hall. And suddenly the air feels heavier. Every gesture means something. Every word hides something. Courtly love was the Middle Ages' answer to having feelings in a world that didn't quite allow them. Marriage wasn't about romance, it was a transaction of land, power, and lineage. So the nobles invented a game, love outside marriage, disguised as virtue. It was like emotional chess played in rhyme and secrecy. You stroll into a grand hall illuminated by hundreds of candles dripping wax like tiny hours falling away. The air is thick with music, lutes, flutes, maybe a harp for extra heartbreak. Poets declaim verses that could mean either divine devotion or something far more carnal. You overhear one. My lady's eyes are the gates of heaven. You smirk. Heaven must have been very well guarded that night. But this wasn't just flirtation. It was education in passion. A knight pledged himself to a lady not for her body, but for the ideal she represented, chastity, grace, unattainable perfection. At least, that's what they said out loud. In reality, the line between admiration and obsession blurred faster than wine stains on velvet. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the same dazzling queen we brushed past earlier, turned her court into a theater for this very kind of love. Troubadours sang of longing so pure it hurt, and noble women judged which verses were most devout. The irony? Many of those same noble women were the muses in question. The whole thing was a polite, glittering hypocrisy, and everyone adored it. One contemporary writer called it the religion of love. There were rules, commandments, even rituals. Don't reveal your passion too quickly. Never speak ill of your lover. Endure jealousy as proof of devotion. It was less like dating and more like joining a cult with better costumes. And yet, under all that elegance, something deeply human stirred. You can feel it as you walk through the garden terrace, roses blooming under moonlight. perfume mingling with the chill of night air. A lady leans against a marble balustrade, her veil trembling slightly. A knight approaches, every movement rehearsed. Their conversation begins with politics, slides into poetry, and ends in silence. Sometimes that silence says everything. There's a small laugh somewhere nearby, a jester, perhaps, mocking the whole ritual. He mutters a rhyme. A knight will die for love. They say. I say, let him die another day. Your first joke tonight, though the nobles wouldn't have dared laugh aloud. Humor, after all, made desire less divine. Historians still argue whether these affairs were truly chaste or cleverly disguised romances. Letters survive, flowery, coded, impossible to decipher fully. One countess wrote to her admirer, "Your absence wounds me more than the sword." Another replied, "My heart serves you as my lord." The metaphors did a lot of heavy lifting in those days. You picture a banquet in full swing, tables groaning under roasted swans and sugared fruits. Conversation hums like a hive. At one end, a bard strums a tune about impossible love, at the other. Someone slips a ring into a goblet. Eyes meet. Words are not needed. It's passion dressed in etiquette. But not everyone played the game willingly. Some marriages fell apart because of it. Kings grew jealous. Duels were fought. Poems banned. Love could elevate you, or ruin you entirely. To love above your station was treason of the heart. Yet the risk made it irresistible. The greater the danger, the sweeter the verse. And then there were the tournaments, ostensibly for glory, but really for showing off in front of ladies. Knights wore their beloved's colors tied to their armor. One chronicler wrote of a knight who lost 3 fingers in combat but refused to drop his lady's scarf. Talk about commitment, or maybe just bad priorities. You lean against a column, feeling the marble cool through your sleeve. The night air carries laughter, clinking goblets, and the faint sound of a lute. You think about how, beneath all the ritual, this was still about connection. People longing to be seen in a world ruled by duty. Maybe that's why the stories endure. They make the past feel alive, messy, and painfully familiar. Another scholar once said that courtly love was a form of rebellion wearing perfume. Maybe he was right. It allowed women a kind of power they rarely held elsewhere, through wit, beauty, and the control of desire itself. Some ladies became legends. They decided who was worthy, who would wait, who would despair. The knights might have carried swords, but the women held the rules. You glance up at the stars glittering above the courtyard. Somewhere out there, a poet is still awake, scratching verses onto parchment, hoping his lady will read them before the ink fades. You imagine him sighing dramatically, muttering something about eternal devotion, and then sneezing because parchment dust isn't very romantic. Here's your second little joke tonight. Medieval love poems aged about as well as medieval hygiene. But the feelings behind them? Those never go stale. As the banquet winds down, couples drift into the shadows of the garden. A few hands brush, a few words are whispered, a few hearts race faster than they should. Somewhere, a harp string breaks with a sharp, sudden note, like the sound of reality interrupting fantasy. Tomorrow, we'll follow the scent of that fantasy to a darker corner of the age, to the apothecaries and witches who sold potions, powders, and charms promising to ignite love or control it. Because when words and poems failed, people turned to magic. For now, the candles burn lower. The nobles retreat behind velvet curtains, their secrets tucked under silk sheets. The night sighs, and you can almost hear a whisper on the wind, "Love me, but never name me." And just like that, the game continues. The moon follows you into the next story, a silver coin hung in a velvet sky. Watching everything and judging nothing. You've left behind the candlelit courts and stepped into a different kind of night. One filled with whispers, herbs, and the faint crackle of hidden fires. The air here smells of damp earth and mystery. This is the world of medieval witchcraft, where love wasn't just sung about, it was brewed. Somewhere on the edge of a village, a cottage leans under the weight of ivy and rumor. Its windows glow faintly with amber light. Inside, an old woman grinds something dark and sticky in a mortar. Her hands are wrinkled, her eyes sharp. She could be anyone, healer, widow, midwife, but to those who seek her at midnight, she is something far more dangerous, a maker of desire. You push open the creaking door. The warmth hits you first, followed by the scent of rosemary, sage, and something musky, almost metallic. Jars line the shelves, labeled in Latin, French, and nonsense. You recognize a few: mandrake root, belladonna, honey of Venus. Others defy translation. Each one promises something forbidden: love, loyalty, or maybe just one reckless night. Love potions were the medieval version of dating apps. Everyone claimed not to use them, but everyone knew someone who did. The recipes varied wildly. Some required only rose petals and wine. Others demanded ingredients best left unnamed. A few even promised eternal devotion, though, in fairness, that often meant poisoning your beloved just enough to keep them weak and dependent. You can't help but chuckle. Till Death Do Us Part had a surprisingly short shelf life in the 14th century. Still, behind every potion was desperation, the aching kind of love that refused to fade. Some women came to these wise folk out of longing, others came out of fear. They wanted to make a husband faithful, a lover return, a rival disappear, and in a world where power and choice were limited, magic became the only language left to speak. The church, of course, hated this. Love spells were labeled heresy, lust mixed with witchcraft, a double sin. Priests warned that such practices invited demons into the soul. Yet ironically, those same priests often kept little sachets of herbs for sleep under their pillows. You reach for one of the jars, the glass cool against your fingers. The label reads aqua ardens, burning water. Likely some primitive perfume, maybe even early alcohol. The old woman behind the table eyes you knowingly. A drop for courage, she says, and another for truth. She pours it into a small cup. The liquid shimmers like melted moonlight. You hesitate, then sip. It burns sweetly down your throat, warming your chest. For a moment, the room feels alive, shadows swaying, the fire pulsing in rhythm with your heartbeat. You realize how easy it must have been to believe in enchantments back then. After all, when life was short, disease common, and love uncertain, hope itself was the strongest magic of all. In some towns, these love witches were tolerated. People needed their skills to heal, to charm, to soothe, but in others, especially when the church's grip tightened, they were hunted. Accusations flew like arrows. A rival's jealousy. A lover's rejection. A bad harvest. The same woman who cured your fever one week might be burned the next. There's a tale from 15th century Germany of a young apothecary's apprentice who created a potion of irresistible affection. It worked too well. The local magistrate fell hopelessly in love with a shepherd's wife, abandoned his duties, and spent his days writing her poetry so terrible that it became its own punishment. Historians still debate whether the potion was real or just wine with crushed herbs. But the scandal? Very real. You hear a cackle outside, or maybe it's laughter carried by the wind. The night seems to lean closer. On the table, a candle flickers, throwing strange shapes on the wall. One shadow looks almost like two figures embracing. The old woman notices your gaze and smiles, revealing teeth like worn ivory. The body, she says softly, is just another kind of spell. That's your first joke tonight, though in her world, it's not entirely a joke. The belief in magical fluids, that passion could be stirred or suppressed with the right combination of elements, wasn't superstition alone. It was medieval science. In its way, physicians wrote long treatises on how certain foods and scents inflamed the humors. Nutmeg for arousal, mint for chastity, basil for infatuation. Somewhere between the doctor's bag and the witch's cauldron, love became chemistry before chemistry was ever born. You wander to the back of the cottage, where herbs hang upside down like sleeping bats. A small wooden box sits on the table. Inside it, folded in linen, is something unexpected, a letter. The handwriting is elegant, the ink faded. You unfold it carefully. To the one who made my heart remember itself. I drank your potion and saw not demons, but my own reflection. I feared it, and I loved it. You close the note gently. The idea lingers. Maybe the real power of these spells wasn't in the ingredients, but in the permission they gave people to feel, to love wildly, to hope foolishly, to reach for something beyond what the world allowed. Historians still argue about how widespread such practices were. Some claim love magic was rare, confined to villages and folklore. Others insist it was everywhere, whispered in royal courts, hidden in convents, disguised as perfume or medicine. Like love itself, it refused to stay in one category. You glance once more at the fire. The old woman is gone. Only her tools remain, pestle, bottles, dried roses, and a faint trace of laughter in the air. The flame dances as if pleased with itself. Outside, the forest hums quietly. The wind smells of pine and smoke. You realize that every age has its own magic. We just change the names. Now it's chemistry, psychology, attraction, but the yearning behind it? The wish to be wanted, to be chosen? That hasn't aged a day. You smiled to yourself. Maybe you don't need a love potion after all. Just a little bit of courage. And perhaps some luck. Tomorrow night, we'll follow that courage into the open, where gestures, glances, and the body itself became a language more eloquent than any prayer. But for now, step carefully back into the moonlight. The spell's fading, but not completely. Somewhere, someone is still whispering your name. The forest fades into soft shadow as you keep walking. The night air is cooler now, cleaner, Quieter, and somewhere in the distance, you hear the low hum of life settling into sleep. Ahead lies a village square dimly lit by torches, where people move in slow, deliberate gestures, their words almost secondary. Here, in the late Middle Ages, the body itself has become its own alphabet. You might think the past was silent, only parchment and prayer, but it was full of unspoken conversations. Before literacy spread, gestures were the first poetry, and glances carried entire stories. Lovers, strangers, merchants, even priests all spoke with their bodies long before they spoke with words. Imagine standing in that square, the cobblestones cold underfoot, the scent of baked bread and animal musk in the air. A woman adjusts her veils slightly to the left, an invitation. A man bows a little too deeply, acceptance. A single touch of fingertips on a goblet might mean yes. A deliberate pause before taking a sip might mean no. The dance of desire in medieval Europe wasn't always physical, often. It lived entirely in the tension of what wasn't done. You can see it more clearly in the courts and markets. Women fan themselves or toy with rosary beads in specific rhythms. Men tilt their heads just enough to signal interest without risking blasphemy. A scholar once joked that the medieval body had more grammar than Latin, and he might not have been wrong. Even fashion played its part. Every layer of fabric told a story: the drape of a cloak, the looseness of a sleeve, the color of a ribbon. In the 14th century, sumptuary laws tried to control who could wear what, because clothing had become dangerous. Too much embroidery? Vanity. Too much lace? Temptation. Too much red? Well, everyone knew what red meant. You stroll through the marketplace, watching people barter and flirt in the same breath. A butcher offers a discount to a woman who laughs too easily. A monk lingers by a spice cart a little too long, pretending to be fascinated by cinnamon. Bodies move like verses of a song, half modesty, half mischief. Somewhere nearby, a troubadour strums his lute and sings. Her glance is the arrow, my heart the shield. The battle is lost, though nothing is revealed. You smile. There's your first joke tonight. Medieval flirting was 90% performance and 10% survival. For all their rigid morals, the people of this age understood the power of subtlety better than we do. Because when pleasure was forbidden, every movement became charged. The way someone held a cup, the brush of cloth against skin, even the act of unbraiding hair before bed, all of it carried meaning. Historians studying manuscripts have found marginal drawings that show lovers communicating through body language, often under the watchful eye of priests or parents. Some are comical, others deeply tender. In a society where expressing love could ruin reputations, the smallest gesture was an act of rebellion. You pass a group of dancers in the square, peasants celebrating after a harvest. Their joy is loud, earthy, honest. Hands clasp, skirts swirl, boots stamp the rhythm into the soil. You can feel it in your chest. That thumping pulse that connects you to them across the centuries. Laughter echoes off the wooden walls. And someone shouts for more wine. It's not a ballad or a sermon. It's the body's purest language. Movement without permission. Of course, the church disapproved. Dancing, it said, invites the devil to lead. But try telling that to a village celebrating the end of famine. You can almost picture a priest glaring from a distance, clutching his rosary, muttering something about sin while his foot taps along to the beat. In royal courts, though, the gestures were slower, more restrained. A lady's curtsy could melt a man's resolve. A knight's bow could promise devotion. And if either dared to touch, even for a heartbeat, it was a spark in a world of dry parchment. One historian wrote that chastity created choreography. Every rule against touch only made the dance more inventive. You see it now. Two figures standing close but not touching. Their shadows overlapping on the stone wall like an embrace they can't afford. Even illness had its own vocabulary. Medieval medicine believed the body's humors could reveal your passions. A flushed face meant lust. Pale skin meant sorrow. Trembling hands meant desire unfulfilled. Physicians wrote entire guides on how to read the body and, naturally, how to control it. One doctor recommended cold baths and cabbage to cool desire. Another prescribed prayer and mint tea. Neither worked. You turn a corner and find yourself in a candlelit chapel again. Smaller this time, almost intimate. A statue of the Virgin Mary stands nearby. Her expression both merciful and knowing. Someone has placed a red rose at her feet, a strange, silent offering. The petals look freshly cut, glistening in the dim light. Was it devotion, or confession of a different kind? For all its superstition, the Middle Ages had an honesty about the body that modern life sometimes lacks. They feared it, yes, but they also revered it. They believed the soul spoke through skin, through eyes, through the smallest twitch of fingers. To sin was to feel too much, but to feel nothing was worse. A gust of wind sneaks through the chapel door, flickering the candles. Shadows bend and twist like dancers bowing out. The scent of wax and rosewater fills your lungs. You realize that, even centuries later, you still understand this silent language. A glance, a gesture, a breath, all the same. And maybe that's the real secret of the Middle Ages. People didn't just communicate desire, they performed it. Every rule birthed a new ritual. Every prohibition a new form of expression. If you couldn't say, "I love you," you could at least pour the wine slowly. Look up through your lashes. And let the silence do the rest. Your second joke tonight. Medieval love might have lacked texting. But they mastered the long stare followed by immediate panic. You smiled to yourself, stepping out into the night. The village is asleep now. Windows dark, the air still humming with warmth. Somewhere, a candle still burns behind a shuttered window. Maybe someone's writing a letter they'll never send. Or simply remembering a look exchanged across a crowded hall. Tomorrow, we'll follow those looks to where indulgence shed its disguise completely, to the grand feasts and masquerades where pleasure ruled openly. If only for a night. But for now, keep your steps quiet. The world is asleep, and the body has said enough for one evening. The night that follows feels heavier, thicker somehow, as if the air itself has been steeped in wine and candle smoke. The faint notes of a flute reach you from somewhere ahead. Playful and strange, you follow the sound through narrow streets until the world opens into a courtyard bursting with light. Lanterns sway, silk ribbons flutter, and laughter ripples like music. Welcome to the masquerade, the place where rules took a night off. You stand at the edge, watching figures glide past in velvet masks and jeweled cloaks. Faces blur into mystery. A bishop's mitre gleams next to a jester's hat. A woman in a gown the color of ripe cherries leans close to whisper something scandalous to a man dressed as a monk. He laughs softly, and you can't tell whether he's amused, embarrassed, or both. The air is alive with contradictions, holiness and hunger, restraint and release. Here, at least for one evening, people could escape their names, their sins, their class. Behind a mask, a peasant might flirt with a duchess. A nun could dance with a knight. Desire was democratic for a few stolen hours. You make your way deeper into the feast. Tables groan under roasted boar. Pears glazed with honey. Mountains of bread as soft as sin. Servants pour wine like liquid rubies into golden goblets. The musician's tempo rises, faster, hotter. Somewhere, someone's shoes tap out a rhythm older than virtue itself. The laughter grows louder. A mask of tragedy leans against a mask of comedy. The joke writes itself. In the Middle Ages, morality had the night off and irony got invited instead. But make no mistake, these feasts weren't just indulgent, they were theatrical. They served a purpose. Life in medieval Europe was strict, suffocating even. The church dictated behavior, kings controlled destiny, and hunger dictated everything else. So when carnival season arrived, especially before Lent, it was more than just a party. It was survival through chaos. You might think of it as emotional spring cleaning. People sinned furiously now so they could repent later with equal enthusiasm. Masks allowed honesty. Ironically, hiding one's face made the soul bolder. A poet once wrote that truth wears a disguise at night. You can see what he meant as a masked woman takes your hand, leading you to the dance floor. Her palm is warm, her perfume sharp and spicy, clove and myrrh. You try to speak, but she hushes you with a smile. Words aren't needed. The viols begin again, slow and haunting. You dance. Every turn is a conversation. Every step, an argument between temptation and restraint. Her mask glints in the torchlight. Her eyes are unreadable. For a moment, you forget what century you're in. The music swells. The crowd spins. And somewhere near the fountain, two men duel with words more dangerous than swords, mocking each other's lovers. Confessions. And verses. The crowd cheers. One of them bows deeply, declaring, "I'd rather be damned for desire than praised for boredom." There's your first joke tonight, and possibly the unofficial motto of the medieval party scene. Not everyone approved, of course. Priests called these festivals the devil's theater. Chroniclers described scenes of excess with trembling pens, though, mysteriously, they remembered an awful lot of detail. One monk from Bruges complained that during Carnival, even the pigs seemed possessed by laughter. You have to appreciate a man who can write a complaint and a comedy at the same time. Still, something almost holy pulses beneath all this chaos. Beneath the masks and gestures, there's a kind of honesty about being human. People who spent all year kneeling finally got to dance. Those who were silent could sing. The hungry could eat until they forgot what scarcity felt like. The poor could wear gold, if only for a night. Historians still debate whether these feasts undermined the church or secretly reinforced it. Some claim Carnival was a safety valve, a ritualized rebellion to keep order from collapsing. Others say it was something deeper, an ancient echo of pagan festivals that refused to die. Either way, the masks hid faces but revealed souls. You catch sight of a nobleman staggering near the fountain, his mask askew. He's laughing too loudly, proclaiming that he's confessing early, sinning efficiently. You chuckle under your breath. Efficiency, such a modern idea. As the night deepens, the masks start to slip. Paint smudges, laces loosen, laughter grows hoarse. Beneath every disguise is the same truth. People just wanted to feel free. To touch without consequence. To exist without judgment. You wander toward the edge of the square where a fire burns low. A few stragglers sit nearby. Faces bare now. The woman who danced with you removes her mask. Her face is ordinary, lovely in its tiredness. She smiles, but it's different now, smaller, softer. Tomorrow, she says, they'll call it sin again. You nod, understanding too well. The church bells will ring at dawn. The laughter will fade, and the masks will go back in their boxes until next year. But for tonight, they've remembered what joy feels like when no one's watching. Your second joke tonight? Maybe the Middle Ages invented the one-night stand. They just called it a feast. The torches burn lower. Music thins to a hum. Then a sigh. Somewhere, a jester's bell jingles faintly as he stumbles home. The scent of spiced wine and wax lingers in the air like a memory that doesn't quite want to leave. Tomorrow, we'll step away from the dance floor and peek behind the velvet curtains, into the private chambers of kings and queens, where passion met power and obsession dressed itself in royal robes. But for now, breathe in the smoke, the laughter, the faint taste of honey and guilt. The masks have fallen. The night is honest again. The night has thinned to its quietest hour. That delicate stretch between indulgence and dawn. You leave behind the laughter of the feast, stepping into the cold corridors of a castle that never truly sleeps. The torches here burn lower, but their flames are steady, fed by oil and secrets. This is the heart of power, where even desire wears a crown. You walk softly. The air smells of wax, wine, and velvet left too long in the dark. Behind these heavy doors, kings dreamed not just of conquest, but of pleasure arranged like politics, methodical, strategic, and often very strange. Because when you have everything, even lust needs invention. A scribe once whispered that royalty loved as they ruled, extravagantly and without mercy. You can see why. The medieval monarch's bedroom was both stage and battleground. Sheets embroidered with gold thread. Servants sleeping just outside. Courtiers gossiping before breakfast. Nothing was private, not even passion. Take King Philip IV of France, for instance. Cold in politics, colder in bed, or so the chronicles claimed. He was said to demand silence during his duties, as if intimacy were another form of taxation. Compare that to his contemporary, Edward II of England, whose rumored affection for a certain knight named Piers Gaveston nearly set the kingdom on fire. Some chroniclers called it brotherly love. Others weren't so charitable. Historians still argue, was it friendship, devotion, or something far less platonic? Royal bedrooms, it seems, had more footnotes than a Bible. You picture one now. A chamber glowing with candlelight, its canopy draped in crimson silk. A queen sits before a mirror of polished silver. Her crown discarded beside a comb. She watches her reflection as if it were another woman entirely, one allowed to want. The door creaks. Someone enters quietly. Bowing low, you look away, not from prudishness, but respect. Desire, when dressed in silk and secrecy, feels almost sacred. Here's your first little joke tonight. History remembers kings for their wars. But half of them were probably just compensating for something. Even queens had their eccentricities. Isabella of Bavaria, for example, was infamous for her collection of perfumed gloves and a tendency to test love charms on her unsuspecting courtiers. Catherine de' Medici, centuries later, took things further, designing perfume bottles shaped like tiny daggers. Because in royal circles, love and poison shared the same shelf. But not all royal passions were cruel. Some were heartbreakingly human. Henry II of England adored Eleanor of Aquitaine long after their marriage soured. Their letters reveal a strange tenderness behind their rivalries. One note from her, preserved only in fragments, reads, "Power fades, but your words remain." Imagine that. A queen conquered by poetry. Not armies. Still, courtly life was a performance. Every smile was calculated, every affair a potential treaty. Mistresses were as political as ambassadors. A queen's favor could grant titles. A king's glance could start a war. Even pleasure had paperwork. You hear footsteps in the corridor, soft leather against stone. A servant hurries past, clutching a silver tray. On it sits a goblet of wine, a folded letter, and a single rose. You wonder if the rose is meant for love or apology. One chronicler described the royal court as a garden of roses, each with its own thorn. He wasn't exaggerating. Hidden behind every story of romance was a quieter one of jealousy, control, and obsession. Kings kept astrologers to predict the best nights for conjugal success. Queens consulted alchemists for potions to increase fertility or fidelity. Half of medieval science was just love advice written in Latin. And then there were the fetishes, the peculiar obsessions whispered in corners but never written down directly. One queen insisted her lovers wear religious medallions during their trysts, claiming it made the act blessed. Another nobleman was rumored to collect locks of hair from every woman he'd ever kissed, storing them in a jeweled reliquary, as if affection were a relic. You pause in the corridor, half smiling. The idea that the mighty could be so sentimental feels almost comforting. Beneath the crowns and crowns of ego, they were still human, lonely, insecure, hopeful. Some historians argue that these royal fixations were less about desire and more about power. To rule another's heart was simply another conquest. To be adored, another form of legitimacy. Yet others suggest the opposite, that for all their control, kings and queens were captives of their own passions. The higher they climbed, the more their desires had to hide. There's a story about a king who disguised himself as a commoner to visit the woman he loved. Slipping through the city gates at midnight, he risked his throne for a single night of anonymity. When his advisors found out, they were furious. He only smiled and said, "I rule my kingdom by day. At night, my heart rules me." That line could have been invented later. It sounds almost too poetic, but you hope it's true. Because for a moment, it makes him real. You walk past a tapestry depicting a hunt, stags chased by hounds, branches twisting into knots. The scene is grand, but you can't help noticing the faces, each hunter's gaze fixed not on the prey, but on one another. Maybe the artist knew exactly what he was doing. Here's your second joke tonight. Medieval love stories didn't need Netflix. They had entire castles full of people pretending not to notice each other. Somewhere, a clock strikes 2. The corridors grow quieter, the air cooler. You can almost feel the ghosts of those royal secrets still breathing here. Perfume, parchment, a whisper against a pillow. And maybe that's the strangest truth of all. Power never erased desire. It only dressed it in gold and called it divine. Tomorrow, we'll leave these royal chambers and walk out into the fields, where passion had fewer rules and simpler stakes, where the peasants, free of etiquette, found their own ways to chase warmth under the same cold moon. But for now, stay here a little longer. The candles flicker low, the wine grows still, and even kings must sleep eventually. The night deepens again, cool and solemn, as you find yourself walking toward the tallest structure in any medieval town, the cathedral. Its spire pierces the sky like a needle stitching heaven to earth. Below, its great doors groan open just enough for you to slip inside. The air changes instantly, colder, thicker, perfumed with incense and centuries of whispered prayers. This is where morality met desire head-on, where the church waged its eternal war against the body and lost. Again and again. The nave stretches before you like a stone ocean. Candles shimmer along the altar, their light flickering against statues of saints who stare down in carved disapproval. A monk's chant hums through the air, low, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. It sounds holy, but if you listen carefully, there's something else beneath it, weariness, maybe even yearning. You sit in a pew, the wood smooth from thousands of knees and elbows. The scent of wax mixes with the faint musk of people who came here seeking forgiveness, or permission, or both, and you can almost feel the contradiction vibrating in these walls. The church that preached purity yet could never quite untangle itself from temptation. The clergy taught that the body was the root of sin, that the flesh was a trap set by the devil. Yet they also told everyone to marry, to be fruitful and multiply. It was like telling people not to breathe too deeply while insisting they keep breathing anyway. Theologians wrote volumes trying to square this circle, and the results ranged from inspired to absurd. One 12th-century scholar declared that marital relations were acceptable only if the participants performed them without delight. You raise an eyebrow. It's hard to imagine how that instruction was enforced. Your first little joke tonight. Medieval priests didn't need to ban pleasure. They just tried to make it sound like bad plumbing. Still, not all within the church were hypocrites. Some genuinely struggled to reconcile the sacred and the sensual. Saint Augustine, centuries earlier, had confessed, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." His honesty became a kind of blueprint for everyone after him. They preached restraint while quietly praying for forgiveness in advance. You wander deeper into the cathedral. Behind the altar lies a smaller chapel reserved for clergy. The walls are lined with frescoes, angels, demons, flames, flowers, all locked in some cosmic negotiation. Here, The priests once gathered to debate how to guide souls, while privately fighting their own. Historians have found letters between monks and bishops filled with anxious questions. What if temptation comes in dreams? What if sin hides in affection? What if the heart refuses to obey? The answers were always the same: pray harder, fast longer, confess sooner. Yet the questions never stopped. You can almost hear the confessional whispers echoing in the aisles: a noble confessing lust, a nun confessing envy, a priest confessing both. Sin became a cycle, one that kept the church powerful because it could both condemn and absolve. And then came the scandals. The priests who fathered children, the bishops accused of bribery and carnal weakness, the abbots whose visits of charity to convents became public jokes. Chroniclers, bless them, tried to sound shocked while recording every detail. One monk wrote that a neighboring abbot had been too generous in sharing his blessings. Subtlety was never their strong suit. Yet amid all this, there were voices of compassion, men and women who argued that love, even physical love, might reflect divine creation rather than defy it. Hildegard of Bingen, a mystic nun and composer, wrote that the human body was a vessel of God's joy. She was centuries ahead of her time, and possibly one papal eyebrow raise away from censorship. Your second joke tonight: if the medieval church had a motto, it would have been, "Do as we preach, not as we secretly panic about." Still, for all its repression, the church also preserved beauty. The chants, the paintings, the architecture, all born from the same longing it tried to suppress. You glance up at the vaulted ceiling, at ribs of stone reaching heavenward, and realize the shape itself mirrors a human body turned inside out, bones of faith, arteries of awe. Maybe that was the irony. To deny the flesh, they immortalized it in stone. You pause near a carved confession booth. The wood is dark, polished by time and touch. You imagine the centuries of secrets absorbed into it, the tremble of voices, the tears, the confessions whispered too softly to judge. Every sin here once felt like the end of the world, and now it's just dust. Outside, the wind rattles the stained glass. A shaft of moonlight breaks through, painting colors across the marble floor: blue for mercy, red for passion, green for hope, the same palette used in every painting, sermon, and sin. The church's battle against pleasure was never really about chastity, it was about control. To define sin was to define power. To forgive it was to keep it close. And through all their rules and rituals, they never stopped depending on the very humanity they condemned. You step back out into the night. The cathedral towers above you, beautiful and impossible, like a contradiction made of stone. Behind you, a priest's chant fades into silence. Ahead, the streets hum with distant laughter from taverns and lovers who couldn't care less about doctrine. Somewhere between them lies the truth. Faith and desire were never enemies. They just never learned how to share a bed. Tomorrow, we'll lift the veil on how that contradiction seeped into art itself, how monks, painters, and scribes turned forbidden passion into hidden masterpieces. But for now, look once more at the spire cutting into the sky. It points upward, yes, but it began from earth, from human hands, from longing that refused to stay quiet. The night softens around you as you leave the cathedral's shadow and step into a smaller chapel nearby, one of those quiet places where art, not doctrine, speaks. The air smells of paint and candle soot, and in the flickering light, you can see what the sermons never said out loud: desire, preserved in color and gold leaf. You might think of medieval art as stiff and holy, saints staring blankly, angels frozen mid-hymn, but look closer. Under the halos and prayers, there's mischief. On the margins of manuscripts, carved into choir stalls, even hidden behind altar panels, artists found ways to express the full range of human longing. It was the Church's most beautiful contradiction. They banned the body but commissioned it endlessly. You approach a wall painting of Adam and Eve. It's familiar, the serpent, the apple, but there's something different here. Eve's face isn't ashamed, she looks curious. Adam isn't recoiling, he's hesitating, intrigued. The painter has given them emotions the priests tried to erase. Lust and innocence at war, and both winning. You can almost hear the artist muttering to himself centuries ago. Brush in hand, whispering, "They told me to paint sin. They didn't say I couldn't make it look inviting." That's your first little joke tonight. But also a truth. In monasteries, where monks spent their lives copying holy texts, the margins often came alive with the opposite of holiness. Scholars today call them drolleries, tiny, irreverent drawings of monkeys dressed as priests, nuns chasing lovers, even knights bending over for reasons best left unexplored. The same hands that wrote psalms also doodled what they probably shouldn't have been thinking about during prayer. It's as if the manuscripts themselves couldn't contain the tension anymore. Between the lines of divine law, the human heart scribbled its rebellion. One surviving book from the 13th century features an entire sequence of rabbits hunting humans, a parody of courtly love and fear, of prey and predator. Another shows a monk kissing a woman beneath the words of the Magnificat. Historians argue whether these images were satire or therapy. Either way, they're confessions made in ink instead of words. And then there were the sculptors. Step into any old cathedral and look low, beneath the pews, under the choir seats, along the columns, and you'll find carvings that would have made the bishops blush. Gargoyles with wicked grins, figures locked in eternal mischief, nuns lifting their skirts to reveal a wink of rebellion. One famous carving in France shows a man balancing a barrel on his back while another peeks out from under it. Both laughing. It's crude, yes, but it's also strangely alive. These weren't just jokes, they were reminders that laughter, like lust, survived even inside stone. The Church tolerated these hidden amusements because few people ever saw them. They were tucked away where only monks or priests would notice, tiny escape hatches for the imagination. Maybe that's why they feel so honest. They weren't for the public, they were for the artist himself. You move toward a display case holding an illuminated manuscript. The gold catches the candlelight and seems to breathe. The text is a sermon, but the margins tell another story. A garden of vines curling into the shape of entwined bodies. To the untrained eye, it's decoration. To anyone paying attention, it's a confession of longing disguised as ornament. The scribe who made it would never admit what he'd done. He might have called it symbolism. Scholars still debate how much was deliberate, but every stroke feels too knowing to be accidental. Art became a safe way to talk about what words couldn't. Painters and illuminators smuggled desire into heaven's frame, turning sin into symmetry. Even the saints began to look suspiciously human, cheeks flushed, eyes soft, fingers lingering on the edges of their halos. You step closer to a sculpture of Mary Magdalene. Her robes ripple like water. And for a moment, you forget she's stone. Her face isn't one of repentance, it's one of relief. Maybe even release. The sculptor carved forgiveness, but it looks a lot like pleasure. That's your second joke tonight. In medieval art, half the saints look like they've just been forgiven for something very enjoyable. Still, it's easy to forget how dangerous these subtle acts were. Artists walked a narrow line between inspiration and accusation. Too much flesh, and they could be called heretics. Too little, and they risked irrelevance. The best of them learned to hide meaning in plain sight, through gesture, color, or shadow. Red for divine love, but also for lust. Blue for purity, but also melancholy. Gold for holiness, but also greed. Every hue doubled as confession. You imagine one of those painters. Late at night, alone in a chapel, his brush moves slowly, reverently. He paints an angel's wings. Then pauses, his eyes tracing the curve of a shoulder, the arch of a hand. For a moment, he forgets heaven entirely. And then he remembers himself, dips his brush in white, and paints over it, but not completely. Because that's what the Middle Ages really did. They covered the body with layers of doctrine and devotion. But the shape still showed through. You leave the chapel, stepping into cool night air. Above you, gargoyles grin from their perches. Rainwater dripping from their fanged mouths. They look half demonic, half delighted, as if they've seen every secret ever whispered under these stones and found it all rather funny. And maybe they have. Tomorrow, we'll turn to one of the strangest symbols of all, the legendary chastity belt. That mix of myth, metal, and misunderstanding that still fascinates the modern mind. But for now, listen to the quiet hum of the night, the flicker of torchlight across the stone. Somewhere, beneath layers of paint and piety, desire still glows faintly, waiting for someone to notice. The night is cool and still, the kind that makes metal sing if you touch it. You're standing before a glass display case in a dimly lit museum, where something small and strange gleams under the light, a chastity belt. A band of iron, curved, locked, cold. It looks like a joke made serious, or a fear turned into hardware. You lean closer, and for a moment, the past stares back. This is the myth that refuses to die. The idea that medieval men locked up their wives before riding off to war. Keys jingling like trophies on their armor. The truth, as always, is messier. There were belts, yes, but not like the stories say. Some were ceremonial, symbolic, even theatrical. Most of the ones we find in museums were made centuries later. In the Renaissance or the Victorian era, when moral panic became a business. But myths have their own power. And this one, born from fear and fascination, tells you everything about how the Middle Ages tried, and failed, to control desire. You imagine a knight preparing to leave for the Crusades. His armor gleams, his horse snorts impatiently. The troubadours sing of glory and faith. But his mind lingers elsewhere, on the woman he's leaving behind. He can't control war, or God, or fate, but her? He can forge metal, so he does. It's a chilling logic. If love is fragile, lock it up. If temptation is dangerous, remove the choice. Of course, most historians now agree that real, functional chastity belts would have been impractical, if not fatal. Iron doesn't breathe, and neither does flesh beneath it. The few surviving examples show no sign of wear, no rust from the body's salt, no real hinges for movement. They were props, not prisons. But the idea alone says enough. It shows how medieval fear of pleasure turned creativity toward cruelty. Control became its own kind of fantasy. There's your first little joke tonight. Leave it to the Middle Ages to invent the world's least romantic padlock. The real tools of chastity were social, not mechanical. Guilt, shame, sermons, and suspicion. The Church insisted that purity was a fortress built from silence. Women were taught to guard their virtue like knights guarded their swords. Men were told to defend theirs by pretending they had none. Still, the image of the belt stuck, first in satire, then in superstition. Poets joked about it. Painters turned it into metaphor. In one Italian fresco, a knight hands his wife a key the size of her arm, smiling like a man proud of his invention. The crowd in the painting laughs, but her eyes don't. You wonder which of them the artist pitied. You walk deeper into the hall. Another case holds a belt made of copper, lined with velvet. It's beautiful, absurd, and disturbing all at once. Beside it lies a note written by a 17th-century collector, proof of the chastity of noble ladies during the Crusades. He was wrong, but he believed it. Maybe belief was the real cage. Historians still argue about the symbol's origin. Some say it began as a moral allegory, protecting virtue against the lustful assault of sin. Others claim it was pure satire, a medieval meme that got wildly out of hand. Whatever it was, by the time the Victorians rediscovered the idea, they turned it into proof of barbaric medieval morality, while quietly enforcing their own. You can't help but notice how every era projects its anxieties onto this one piece of metal. The Middle Ages feared temptation. The Victorians feared the body. We, perhaps, fear control itself. Your second joke tonight. Every generation rediscovers the chastity belt, and every generation insists it was meant for someone else. But beyond the irony, the object tells a story about power. Not just male over female, but fear over freedom. It's the same story told by every sermon that warned against pleasure. Every painting that turned longing into punishment. The belt just made the metaphor literal. And yet, even in its cold absurdity, it reveals something deeply human. You run your fingers along the edge of the glass, tracing its reflection. There's longing even in the act of suppression, the desperate wish to freeze what can't be fixed. To make faith and desire obey the same rules. A curator once wrote that the chastity belt is a relic of obsession masquerading as morality. That feels right. It's less about purity and more about panic, the need to own what can never truly belong to you. You step away from the case, leaving the metal to gleam in its false innocence. Outside, the night is soft again, and the air feels like freedom. No locks, no keys, just the hum of the living world. In the distance, you hear the faint strains of a song, a woman's voice. Low and steady, maybe it's a lover's lullaby, maybe a widow's lament. Either way, it carries the same quiet defiance. You can restrain the body, but never the heart. Tomorrow, we'll enter another strange corner of this age, the world of medieval medicine, where doctors tried to diagnose and cure desire with methods so bizarre you'll be grateful for modern science. But for now, breathe. The night's cool air wraps around you like release. The past may have tried to lock love away, but somehow, it always found the key. The night smells faintly of herbs and smoke as you step into a narrow chamber lit by oil lamps. Shelves crowd the walls, jars of powder, dried roots, coiled snakes suspended in glass. This is the medieval physician's domain, where medicine and magic blur. And the most mysterious ailment of all isn't plague or fever, but desire. A man in a long robe looks up from his desk. His hands are stained with ink and something darker, perhaps blood. Perhaps crushed berries. He greets you like an alchemist. Half scholar, half gambler. "You're here about love?" he asks, already knowing the answer. In the Middle Ages, doctors treated passion the same way they treated everything else, by balancing the humors. To them, the human body was a cauldron of four liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Every emotion, every impulse, was a chemical imbalance waiting for correction. Love, they said, was simply too much heat in the blood. Desire was a fever, and like all fevers, it needed purging. Their treatments ranged from strange to dangerous. Cold baths to calm the flesh. Diets of lettuce, vinegar, and fish. Leeches placed, well, in places you don't want to imagine. For women, doctors prescribed crushed pearls and rosewater to cool the womb. For men, bleeding and prayer. You wonder which was more effective. There's your first little joke tonight. Medieval love medicine could cure anything, except the patient's will to live. The physician gestures for you to sit. He opens a thick book bound in leather and reads aloud. Too much pleasure dries the brain, heats the heart, and summons melancholy. You glance at him. He seems perfectly melancholic already. He continues flipping pages, muttering remedies for every variation of desire. Lust for a stranger, longing for a spouse, envy of another's beauty. There's a salve for restless nights, made of saffron, honey, and, somehow, ashes of dove. Another recipe suggests wrapping oneself in damp cloth and reciting psalms until the temptation passes. It sounds less like medicine and more like surrender. But the doctors weren't alone in their obsession. The church, as always, had its own cures. Monks recommended fasting to weaken the flesh. Confessors prescribed endless repetition of prayers. A particularly inventive bishop suggested carrying a pebble in one's shoe as a reminder of discomfort, pain to distract from pleasure. You can almost hear him saying, "If it hurts, it must be working." Historians still debate whether these remedies were sincere or symbolic. Some believe they were genuine attempts at therapy. Others see them as moral theater, where science bowed to scripture. But the strangest truth is that medieval physicians didn't see a difference between body and soul. For them, lust was a disease of both. One case stands out in the records. A noblewoman from Florence diagnosed with erotic melancholy. Her symptoms? Daydreaming, sighing, loss of appetite, sudden bursts of poetry. The doctor prescribed prayer, long walks, and the occasional slap of cold water. She recovered, though the physician noted she did not seem grateful. You move around the room, peering into jars. One holds powdered ambergris, another dried figs labeled for vigor. A third, disturbingly, contains ground beetles. The physician explains that beetles arouse the spirit. You're not sure whose spirit he means. In another jar, something white glows faintly in the lamplight. Unicorn horn, he says proudly. You try not to laugh. He's referring to narwhal tusk, a prized cure for every ailment. Real or imagined, a few shavings, he adds, can cool even the hottest passions. You suspect that might depend on where he puts them. Medicine, it seems, was as much theater as faith. Doctors borrowed from ancient Greeks, Arab scholars, and local superstition, blending everything into one strange recipe for control. To heal desire, they treated it like madness. And sometimes, it truly did drive people mad. Medieval writings describe lovesickness as a legitimate mental illness, patients fainting, sweating, hallucinating the faces of their beloved. One physician wrote that he'd seen a monk, so consumed by longing, that his pulse changed when he heard a woman's name. The cure? Bloodletting. Always bloodletting, as if romance itself were a toxin to be drained. Your second joke tonight, if heartbreak bled. Medieval doctors would have been the richest men alive. Yet beneath all the superstition, there was an honesty in how they viewed passion. They saw desire as something that could heal or destroy, a force equal parts sacred and dangerous. When the right balance was found, it made life vibrant. When it tipped too far, it consumed. You look closer at the physician now. His eyes are tired but kind. It isn't the body, he says softly. It's the loneliness that makes people sick. You realize he's more philosopher than doctor. Maybe he's seen too many patients crushed by rules pretending to cure them. He closes his book and gestures to a vial of lavender oil. For calm, he says, not to kill the fire, but to make it burn slower. That sounds wiser than anything in his dusty tomes. Outside, the night air feels cleaner. You breathe deeply, the scent of herbs still clinging to your sleeves. The world hums with quiet life, the chirp of crickets, the distant trickle of water. And you think about how the Middle Ages tried so hard to treat love as an illness, when maybe it was the only thing keeping them human. Medicine has advanced since then, but people haven't changed much. We still look for cures to feelings we don't understand. We still try to control what frightens us, even when it's the very thing that keeps our hearts beating. Tomorrow, we'll explore those hearts more closely, not the physical ones, but the ones that beat quietly behind the power of women, the secret strength of those who learned to use desire as survival, not sin. But for now, let the lamps dim, the jars gleam faintly, their shadows stretching like old ghosts across the walls. You leave the doctor's chamber with one final thought. Sometimes the cure isn't to silence the heart, it's to listen to it carefully. And let it speak. The next night feels softer, quieter, as if the world itself has paused to listen. You've left behind the physicians and their jars of dust and superstition. And now you walk through a narrow stone corridor that leads not to a chapel or a tavern, but to a room glowing faintly with lamplight. Voices hum inside, low, measured, deliberate, women's voices. You stop at the doorway. Inside sit half a dozen women, some young, some gray-haired, gathered around a table scattered with wax tablets, sewing needles, and parchment. They're talking quietly, but the conversation isn't about saints or sin. It's about influence, about survival, about men who think they rule the world, and the women who let them believe it. Welcome to the real court of the Middle Ages, the one behind the curtains, behind the crowns, behind the sermons. You step closer, and one woman looks up. Her eyes are steady, calm in a way that power always is when it knows it doesn't need to announce itself. "We're not witches," she says, smiling faintly. "We're listeners." She's right. These women don't cast spells, they read people. They navigate the dangerous dance between pleasure and power, turning desire into leverage in a world where almost everything else is forbidden. A queen might use affection to sway a king's decision. A lady-in-waiting might trade secrets for protection. A merchant's wife might control the family's fortunes while her husband drinks himself into oblivion. None of them could vote or lead an army, but all of them learned how to rule in whispers. The chroniclers rarely wrote about this kind of influence. It wasn't dramatic enough. No wars, no decrees, no blood, but every policy, every treaty, every betrayal had a woman's shadow behind it. The men carried swords, the women carried knowledge. And knowledge, in any century, is the sharper weapon. One woman at the table, her hair wrapped in silk, is reciting a letter aloud. It's not a love letter, though it sounds like one. "My heart trembles when you are near. My loyalty burns brighter in your absence." The others smile knowingly. It's coded language, a promise of alliance. Not affection, lust disguised as diplomacy, or perhaps the other way around. You think of Eleanor of Aquitaine again, queen, mother, prisoner, and legend. Historians still debate whether she was a romantic or a strategist. The truth, as usual, is both. She used her charm like a blade and her intelligence like armor. When men tried to confine her, she simply waited. Time, after all, was the one thing women understood better than kings. There's your first little joke tonight. In the Middle Ages, patience wasn't a virtue, it was a superpower. Women in convents, too, wielded influence through less visible means. Their letters, prayers, and art often doubled as coded defiance. Some abbesses ran their communities like miniature kingdoms, managing land and money with a grace that made bishops nervous. One even wrote to the Pope himself, politely reminding him that the soul has no gender. You can almost hear the collective gasp that followed. In the secular world, women used whatever tools they had, beauty, wit, empathy, to create small freedoms inside large cages. A glance could open a door. A word could save a life. A rumor, well placed, could shift the fate of an entire court. You imagine a scene. A grand banquet in a castle hall. The men toast to honor and conquest. The women toast to endurance. At the head of the table, a queen laughs at something her husband says. Her expression warm, her eyes unreadable. She reaches for her goblet, careful to let her sleeve brush the arm of the noble beside her, just enough to make him wonder if it was an accident. She doesn't need to speak. She's already won. Not all stories were victories, of course. Many women paid dearly for stepping too far beyond expectation. Some were branded temptresses, others heretics. A few were executed for being too clever. too influential, too unwilling to fade into the background. Desire, for them, wasn't just emotion, it was risk. Still, the clever ones found ways to survive. A widow might turn her inheritance into power. A midwife might gather secrets from every household she visited. A courtesan might become a diplomat, trading words instead of favors. History remembers the kings, but behind every decision was a woman who knew how to whisper at the right moment. One historian called them architects of circumstance. Another dismissed them as manipulators. Both descriptions miss the point. In a world designed to silence them, these women built a language out of silence itself. You watch as one of the women at the table draws a small symbol in wax, a flower. Stylized and subtle, it's a code, a mark left in correspondence to signal loyalty. Another woman adds a drop of wine on top of it, sealing it with her ring. These gestures are small, invisible to anyone outside the room, but they hold the weight of survival. Your second joke tonight: medieval men wrote the laws. But medieval women wrote the footnotes, and everyone knows that's where the real story hides. You look around the room again. The lamps cast halos of gold on their faces. And for a moment, you realize how much of the Middle Ages lived in these quiet spaces, the pauses between sermons, the moments behind the throne, the conversations no chronicler dared to record. As you step back into the night, the cool air hits your face. You can hear laughter from the castle above, drunken voices from the tavern below, and somewhere between them, the soft hum of women's voices still weaving plans. Power, you think, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it breathes softly, smiles politely, and waits until the right moment to strike. Tomorrow, we'll cross continents to the east, where Europe's travelers returned with tales of spices, silk, and seductive wonders that reshaped how the West dreamed about pleasure. But for now, walk quietly. The night belongs to them, the ones history tried to forget, but who never really disappeared. The wind carries a different scent tonight: spice, smoke, and something you can't quite name. You're no longer in the cramped stone chambers of Europe. The horizon glows with faraway fires, and the air hums with languages you've never heard. This is the crossroads of the medieval world, the ports, caravan trails, and merchant halls where the East met the West, and fantasy met fact. It's easy to forget that the Middle Ages weren't isolated. They were connected by trade routes that stretched from Venice to Damascus, from Cairo to Cathay, and along with silk, ivory, and pepper came something far more intoxicating: stories. Stories of strange lands where beauty was worshipped, pleasure refined, and desire spoken without shame. You arrive at a bustling port, Venice, maybe, or Genoa. The docks are crowded with sailors unloading crates, merchants shouting in half a dozen tongues. A man in a long robe unfurls bolts of fabric dyed deeper than blood. Another displays a jar of amber-scented oil, claiming it can make a man irresistible and a woman unforgettable. Judging by the crowd around him, no one's doubting the advertisement. To the medieval imagination, the East was a mirror of its own suppressed desires. It was everything Europe feared and secretly envied. Travelers returned from the Crusades and trading expeditions with tales of harems, perfumed gardens, and feasts where the rules of chastity were as soft as the cushions. Were these stories true? Rarely. But truth mattered less than the fantasy. There's your first little joke tonight. Nothing fueled medieval imagination like a traveler with a good lie and bad lighting. Writers and artists devoured these tales. Poets described the East as a realm of luxurious excess, where even the air was seductive and every spice a promise. The imagery seeped into European art, paintings of pale maidens reclining on silk, knights dreaming of Saracen beauties, and scholars translating Arabic love poems they pretended to disapprove of. The real influence ran deeper. From Persia and Arabia came the works of philosophers like Avicenna and poets like Rumi, texts that treated love not as sin, but as the essence of the divine. The idea that passion could lead to enlightenment was revolutionary to a Europe still terrified of its own heartbeat. One translated line, copied and recopied in monastic script, read, "Love is the flame that burns away the self, leaving only truth." Imagine how that sounded to a monk who'd spent his life fasting to extinguish desire. A dangerous idea, yes, but also a liberating one. You walk through a merchant's hall where tapestries hang from every wall. One shows an imagined scene, a sultan reclining among courtiers, wine cups glinting, music rising. The embroidery is exquisite and completely inaccurate. The East of European imagination was less geography and more dreamscape, a place to project everything forbidden at home. Even medicine borrowed from the mystique. Aphrodisiacs made of cinnamon, ginger, and cardamom were imported in tiny pouches and sold for fortunes. A Venetian merchant once bragged that his Eastern powder could make any woman sing like an angel. No record survives of whether it worked, but the idea sold well enough to fund a ship. Historians still debate how much of this fascination was admiration and how much was anxiety. Europe looked eastward and saw both temptation and threat, a world that seemed freer, more sensual, more alive, so it did what humans always do when faced with envy. It mythologized it. You pause near a spice table, watching the merchant scoop crimson powder into a pouch. The smell is dizzying, sweet, hot, alive. A young nobleman beside you whispers. They say even the air of the East is different, that people there live by scent, not sight. You smile. He's clearly never been farther east than his own vanity mirror. Still, it's easy to understand the allure. In a continent where passion was chained to guilt, the idea of another world that celebrated it must have felt like salvation. And so, the fantasies multiplied, dancers draped in jewels, lovers in hidden courtyards, secret gardens blooming under moonlight. It was all projection, of course. But projection can be powerful. One medieval theologian even warned that the devil hides in foreign spices. You can't help but laugh. The man probably just didn't like cinnamon. Your second joke tonight. Medieval Europe discovered global trade and immediately turned it into fan fiction. But beneath the exaggeration, something real was happening. The exchange of ideas between East and West changed how Europe thought about love, beauty, and the body. It softened the fear, even if just a little. Translators brought back poetry that spoke of affection without shame, longing without guilt. In secret, European writers began to imitate it, slowly, cautiously, a seed of empathy planted by curiosity. You step outside the hall, the night alive with new sounds, the hum of the sea, the distant clink of glass, the whisper of wind through sails. The moon hangs low over the water, gilding every ripple. Somewhere, someone is playing a stringed instrument, the melody foreign but familiar in its yearning. The East that the medieval world imagined may not have existed, but the longing for it did. It represented everything repressed and unreachable. Everything the church refused to name but the heart couldn't forget. You breathe in the spice-thick air one last time and smile. Maybe it doesn't matter whether those stories were true. Sometimes, the fantasy itself reveals the truth we're too afraid to face, that desire, like trade winds, crosses every border. Tomorrow, we'll return to Europe to witness the twilight of the Middle Ages, the moment when decadence met decay, and the old world began to give way to the Renaissance's awakening. But for now, listen to the water lap against the docks. The world feels wider tonight, and for the first time in a long time, the air smells free. The night feels different now, older somehow, but also restless, like an age about to wake from a long dream. You're standing at the edge of change, where the Middle Ages begin to crumble, and something new, something brighter, sharper, and infinitely more curious, rises to take its place. The year might be 1450, maybe 1475, no one knows it yet, but the world is tilting toward the Renaissance. You walk through a grand hall in Florence, its walls glimmering with frescoes and candlelight. The air smells of wet plaster and ambition. Artists and philosophers mingle with merchants and nobles, everyone speaking in that intoxicating mixture of piety and pride. Gold dust hangs in the air like pollen. You can almost feel it, this moment when beauty stopped being a sin and started being a science. Desire, long buried under sermons, begins to stretch its limbs. Paintings bloom with bodies again, real bodies. Soft and imperfect, but alive. The Virgin Mary now has cheeks that blush. Angels with shoulders that gleam in light. Even the saints seem to be breathing differently. The painters talk about anatomy, proportion, perspective, words that sound technical, but all mean one thing: permission. You pass by an easel where a young artist works feverishly under lamplight. He's studying the curve of a model's neck, tracing with his brush not just flesh, but fascination. The church might call it idolatry, but he calls it study. You realize what's happening. Sin has been rebranded as art. That's your first little joke tonight. Only the Renaissance could turn lust into a career move. But it wasn't just painters. Writers, too, began to flirt with freedom. The poems of Petrarch and Boccaccio dared to describe passion without apology. Their verses spoke not of eternal punishment, but of human wonder, the thrill of feeling alive. One line from Petrarch reads, "Love discovered me naked, and I felt no shame." That single sentence probably caused a dozen monks to spill their ink in horror. The printing press had just been born, and suddenly, the secrets of centuries could travel faster than gossip. Ideas once whispered in monasteries now echoed across cities. People read about anatomy, astronomy, even the forbidden pleasures of the ancients. The same civilization that once chained thought was now feeding it wine and asking for another round. Yet the shift wasn't just intellectual. You can feel it in the streets. The people move differently. Clothes loosen, colors brighten, women walk with their heads higher. Men speak more softly when they pass. Desire is no longer something to hide, it's something to refine. Still, not everyone celebrates. The church watches all this with wary eyes. Preachers thunder from pulpits about moral decay and new paganism. In Florence, one monk named Savonarola burns paintings and books in a bonfire, calling them temptations of the devil. You can almost hear him shouting as the smoke curls upward, carrying beauty into the sky. The crowd cheers, half in faith, half in fear. And yet, fire cannot unlearn what light has revealed. You walk along the Arno River, where reflections of lanterns shimmer like molten gold. Across the water, you see a group of scholars laughing, arguing, probably about Plato and love, about whether passion could lead to divinity. One quotes the ancients, "Beauty is the visible form of goodness." Another counters, "Then why does it feel like madness?" Both are right. Desire in the Renaissance becomes philosophy. No longer something to flee from. It's studied, dissected, celebrated. Lovers exchange poems instead of confessions. Artists sketch models not out of guilt but out of awe. Science and sensuality walk hand in hand for the first time in centuries. Your second joke tonight, after 300 years of guilt, humanity decided it deserved a rebrand, and called it humanism. But even as the Renaissance frees the flesh, it still worships it from a distance. Beauty becomes idealized again, sculpted into perfection. Michelangelo's David stands tall and pure, nude. Yes, but untouchable. Venus rises from her shell. All curves and calm, but she's marble, not mortal. The body is free, but still frozen in admiration. You pause before a new fresco being unveiled. The painter steps back, satisfied. The scene glows with color, gods, mortals, passion, music. It's bold, unapologetic, and, for the first time in centuries, joyful. You watch as the crowd murmurs approval. Even the priest nearby can't help but nod before crossing himself. Change has already won. And yet, beneath all the splendor, a faint echo remains, the old medieval fear. Quieter now but still alive. Whispering that too much beauty leads to ruin. Maybe that's why Renaissance art is so bittersweet. It celebrates what it knows won't last. The body will age, the paint will crack, the lovers will fade, but for a moment, they existed without shame, and that was enough. You step outside the hall into the cool night. The stars above seem brighter than before. Scientists have started charting them. Poets naming them. The universe no longer feels like a cage, but a conversation. Somewhere behind you, someone plays a lute, the melody rising like laughter from another lifetime. The Middle Ages, for all their darkness, never really disappeared. They transformed. Every fear became a myth. Every myth became art. And every act of repression gave birth to something beautiful in return. That's the paradox, the perverse pleasure of history itself. Tomorrow, we'll bring the story home, with one last reflection on everything these centuries of contradiction left behind, guilt and grace, sin and celebration, repression and revelation. But for now, stand under the starlight and breathe it in. The air smells of paint and possibility. You've walked through 1,000 years of desire, and it's still burning. The night has quieted to a hush now, no tavern laughter. No church bells, just the soft, rhythmic breathing of a world finally at rest. You've walked through centuries of contradictions, desire and denial, faith and folly, and now you stand at the edge of dawn, where the medieval shadows dissolve into morning. The story has slowed, softened, history exhales. You find yourself in a quiet garden behind a ruined abbey. The stones are cracked, the ivy thick, but the air feels gentle, forgiving. Somewhere nearby, a fountain trickles lazily, the water silver in the moonlight. You sit on a low wall, hands tracing the cool surface of the stone, worn smooth by time and touch. It's peaceful, and for the first time, you realize that peace, like pleasure, was always what everyone had been chasing. You think back through all the rooms and faces you've passed. The masked dancers laughing beneath torchlight. The kings and queens trapped in their gilded games. The peasants finding warmth in fields of mud. The priests whispering sins in the dark. The painters, the poets, the healers, all of them trying to make sense of the same mystery. Why something as fleeting as desire could feel so eternal. If the Middle Ages had one unspoken truth, it was this: the more they tried to bury the body, the more the soul cried out through it. There's your first quiet joke tonight, apparently. Repression is just foreplay for history. You tilt your head back and look at the stars, bright, cold, impossibly far away. Astronomers once believed they were fixed, unchanging. Now, you know they move. Everything does. The heart of a monk, the hand of a lover, even the faith of a king. Change is the only constant the Middle Ages ever feared, and the only one that survived them. From here, the contradictions almost make sense. The Church's sermons about purity created poetry about longing. The fear of sin gave birth to the study of anatomy. The rules meant to silence passion made artists whisper louder, paint brighter, write deeper. Out of suppression came expression. Out of guilt, beauty. You smile faintly. Humanity, it seems, has always been wonderfully perverse that way. As dawn begins to pale the horizon, you hear the faint sound of bells again, no longer the toll of warning, but of welcome, a new day stretching over the ruins of an old one. You imagine the monks who once lived here, their prayers floating up through the same morning mist. Maybe they were never the enemies of desire after all. Maybe they were just afraid of how powerful it was. You walk through the grass, dew brushing your ankles, the world smelling of earth and light. A small bird flits past, startling you with its freedom. You laugh quietly at yourself. Even after 20,000 words of medieval temptation, a bird still wins the prize for purest pleasure. Your second and last joke tonight: if sin was the original medieval entertainment, redemption was the encore. You stop near the fountain. The water ripples as a leaf falls in. The sound is small but endless. It feels like the perfect metaphor, the surface disturbed, but never destroyed. That's how history works. Every age ripples into the next, carrying its shadows with it. The guilt of the Middle Ages became the self-awareness of the Renaissance. The lusts they feared became the freedoms we defend. And yet, even now, the old questions linger. Can love ever be pure? Can faith and flesh coexist without shame? Can pleasure be sacred? The answers don't matter as much as the asking. Each generation finds its own way of sinning beautifully. You close your eyes and breathe. The garden smells of lavender and rain. The wind moves gently through the grass, whispering as it goes. Maybe it's saying that history isn't a lesson to be memorized, but a lullaby, a reminder that humans, for all their madness, have always longed to feel alive. The first rays of sunlight spill over the ruins. Soft and golden, they touch the stones, the grass, the water, and finally, your face. You can almost feel the weight of the centuries lifting, the noise fading into quiet understanding. You whisper to yourself, all that pain, all that fear, all that hunger, and still, somehow, love survived. Now the story has no need for masks or sermons. Just rest. Let the garden fade. Let the centuries drift back into silence. You've seen the beauty, the absurdity, the tenderness, and the cruelty of it all, and you've made it to morning. The birds begin to sing. The world wakes again, innocent as if nothing ever happened. And maybe that's the point. Every age sins. Every age repents. Every age begins again, reaching for the same impossible grace. The light grows brighter. The words slow down. Your breathing steadies. The story folds itself closed. Softly, like a pair of hands in prayer. Sleep now. The past can wait. End of script. Sweet dreams.